Chapter 1. Influence is one of the most misunderstood powers in human life. Many people imagine it as a gift reserved for naturally charismatic personalities, public speakers, sales experts, or leaders with a commanding presence. In truth, influence is far more ordinary and far more available than most people think. It is not the art of overpowering others, nor is it the skill of forcing agreement. Real influence is the ability to move people's thoughts, emotions, and decisions in a direction you want by creating trust, clarity, comfort, and relevance. It works because human beings do not make decisions in a vacuum. They respond to tone, timing, identity, emotion, status, repetition, social proof, and the feeling that something makes sense inside their own world. Once you understand that, influence stops looking magical and starts looking structured. At the deepest level, every person is driven by a few basic needs: the need to feel safe, the need to feel respected, the need to feel understood, and the need to feel that their choices make sense. Whenever you communicate with someone, those needs are either supported or threatened. If your words create pressure, confusion, or ego conflict, resistance rises. If your words create clarity, dignity, and a sense of shared purpose, resistance falls. This is why some people can say very little and still have enormous impact, while others speak constantly and change almost nothing. Influence is not measured by volume. It is measured by effect. A person becomes influential when other people begin to assign weight to their words. Weight does not come from noise. It comes from consistency. When your behavior matches your message, people begin to trust that you are stable. When your promises match your actions, people begin to believe that you are reliable. When your emotions remain under control in difficult moments, people begin to sense that you can be depended on. That dependency does not necessarily mean obedience. It means people feel safer considering your perspective because your presence seems coherent. In a world full of contradictions, coherence is persuasive. The first major principle of influence is that people respond to emotional meaning before they respond to logic. This does not mean logic is useless. It means logic usually arrives second. Human beings like to believe they are rational, but most decisions are filtered through feeling. They ask themselves whether something feels beneficial, risky, embarrassing, exciting, fair, practical, or socially acceptable. Only after that do they justify the decision with reasons. This is why facts alone often fail. A fact without emotional relevance is just information. A fact connected to identity, fear, desire, or aspiration becomes persuasion. The skilled influencer does not merely present information. They attach meaning to it. That meaning must be relevant to the other person, not just impressive to you. Many people sabotage their own influence because they talk about what interests them instead of what matters to the listener. Influence requires audience awareness. The question is never only, what do I want to say? The more important question is, how does this land in the mind of the person receiving it? That shift in orientation changes everything. It moves you from self-expression to strategic communication. It makes you less centered on being heard and more centered on being effective. The more accurately you understand the listener's priorities, the easier it becomes to shape the conversation. One of the most powerful habits of influential people is observation. Before they try to persuade, they study. They listen carefully. They pay attention to words, pauses, posture, tone, and what is not being said. This matters because people often reveal more through hesitation than through speech. If someone answers quickly, they may already have a clear preference. If they delay, avoid, or soften their response, there is likely a hidden concern. Influence improves when you learn to detect those concerns early. Then your message can meet the real objection instead of arguing with the surface objection. A weak communicator tries to win against resistance. A strong communicator identifies the source of resistance and addresses it directly. Trust is the currency of influence. Without trust, even the best argument sounds suspicious. With trust, even a difficult message becomes easier to accept. Trust does not come from perfection. It comes from predictability, honesty, and care. People trust those whose patterns are understandable. They trust those who do not constantly switch positions for convenience. They trust those who admit uncertainty when uncertainty exists. In a strange way, modesty often increases influence because it signals that you are not trying to manipulate the room with fake certainty. A person who says, "I may be wrong, but here is what I see," often gains more respect than someone who pretends to know everything. People are drawn to confidence, but they stay with integrity. Another key principle is that people resist feeling controlled. If they sense that you are trying to corner them, force them, shame them, or take away their autonomy, they will defend themselves even when your point is valid. This is one of the most important truths in persuasion. Human beings protect freedom instinctively. When they feel pushed, they push back. When they feel respected, they become open. That is why the most effective influencers do not sound like dictators. They sound like guides. They create room for others to arrive at. Agreement without humiliation. They understand that people are more likely to commit to a conclusion they feel they discovered than one they feel was imposed on them. Questions are one of the best tools for this. A question invites participation. It lowers defensiveness. It turns the listener into a co-thinker rather than a passive target. When you ask thoughtful questions, you shape the direction of thought without triggering the alarms that come with direct pressure. A well-placed question can expose contradictions, surface priorities, and gently move someone toward reflection. This is one reason skilled negotiators and leaders ask more than they tell. Questions make the other person feel involved, and involvement increases receptivity. The goal is not to trick people. The goal is to create a mental pathway where agreement feels natural. Story is another essential tool of influence. Facts explain. Stories make people feel. Facts can tell someone what is true, but stories help them understand what it means. A story gives a face to the abstract. It creates memory, emotional context, and personal relevance. People rarely remember a raw principle by itself, but they remember how a principle showed up in a real person's life, in a conflict, in a failure, or in a transformation. Good storytellers know this. They do not tell stories only to entertain. They tell stories to frame ideas in a way the mind can hold. This is why a single vivid example can sometimes persuade more powerfully than a long list of arguments. Influence also depends on positioning. How people see you affects how they hear you. If you are seen as anxious, desperate, or inconsistent, your words lose force. If you are seen as calm, steady, and purposeful, your words gain authority. Positioning is not about fake image building. It is about ensuring your external behavior supports the role you want to play in other people's minds. If you want to be seen as thoughtful, act thoughtfully. If you want to be seen as dependable, be dependable. If you want to be seen as serious, carry yourself seriously. Identity is communicated through pattern, not slogans. People believe what your repeated behavior tells them. Timing matters just as much as content. A brilliant idea delivered at the wrong moment can fail completely. A simple message delivered when someone is ready can have massive effect. People are not equally receptive at all times. They are more open when they feel calm, respected, and unthreatened. They are less open when they feel rushed, embarrassed, defensive, or overloaded. Good influence respects emotional timing. It does not force insight into a moment of tension. It waits for the point where the person can actually receive what is being said. Patience is not weakness. It is strategic restraint. There is also a social dimension to influence. Human beings are deeply affected by what others around them think and do. People often look to the group to decide what is normal, acceptable, and smart. This is why social proof is so powerful. When people see that others they respect have already accepted an idea, they become more willing to consider it themselves. Social proof does not guarantee truth, but it does shape perception. That is why communities, networks, and reputation matter so much. Influence is rarely just individual. It spreads through relationships. The stronger your network of trust, the more your ideas travel. However, influence without ethics becomes manipulation, and manipulation destroys the very trust that makes influence possible. If you use understanding of human psychology only to exploit fear, vanity, insecurity, or dependence, you may gain short-term compliance, but you lose long-term credibility. The most effective influence is not extractive. It is constructive. It helps people move toward better decisions, better clarity, and better outcomes. It does not require deception. It requires skillful framing and genuine respect. People are not machines to be programmed. They are minds to be understood. The moment you forget that, your influence becomes shallow and unstable. The deepest form of influence comes from character. Character is not simply a moral decoration. It is a strategic asset. People quickly sense whether you are sincere, whether you mean what you say, whether you keep your word, and whether your behavior remains the same when nobody is watching. These qualities create a kind of gravity. Others begin to orient themselves around you because they trust the structure of your presence. That kind of influence lasts much longer than charisma. Charisma can win attention, but character wins continuity. Attention fades. Character compounds. If you want to influence people at a high level, begin with self-mastery. Learn to regulate your emotions, listen without defensiveness, observe without rushing, and speak with intention rather than impulse. Learn to ask better questions. Learn to detect what people value. Learn to present ideas in ways that protect dignity while still moving the conversation forward. Learn to respect the invisible rules of trust, timing, and relevance. Most of all, learn that persuasion is not a battle to be won, but a bridge to be built. People follow what feels credible, safe, and meaningful. When you understand that deeply, your words stop being just words. They become direction. Influence is not about controlling everybody. It is about understanding people well enough that your message can land where it matters. That is the real beginning of power. Not domination, not manipulation, not performance. Understanding, consistency, and the ability to move human attention toward a better conclusion. That is where influence starts, and that is where it becomes lasting. People do not respond to reality directly, they respond to their interpretation of reality. That interpretation is shaped by framing, context, past experience, emotional state, and expectations. Two individuals can face the same situation and react in completely different ways, not because the situation is different, but because their perception of it is different. This is where influence operates at a deeper level. It is not only about what you say, but how you position what you say inside the mind of the listener. Framing is one of the most decisive mechanisms of influence. The way you present an idea determines how it is received before it is even evaluated. For example, if something is framed as a loss, people become cautious and defensive. If the same thing is framed as a gain, they become more open and optimistic. This is not manipulation. It is a reflection of how the human brain prioritizes survival. Loss feels more urgent than gain. Risk feels more intense than opportunity. A skilled communicator understands this and frames messages in a way that reduces unnecessary fear while maintaining honesty. Consider how people respond differently to "you might fail if you try this" versus "you have a strong chance to succeed if you approach this correctly." Both statements acknowledge uncertainty, but one amplifies fear while the other emphasizes possibility. The second statement does not deny risk. It places it within a structure that feels manageable. That subtle difference can determine whether someone takes action or withdraws. Influence, therefore, often lies in how you balance realism with encouragement. Another critical element of perception is context. No idea exists in isolation. The surrounding information changes how the idea is judged. If you present a proposal immediately after highlighting a major problem, the proposal feels like a solution. If you present the same proposal without context, it may feel unnecessary or even intrusive. This is why sequencing matters. The order in which you present information shapes the mental pathway of the listener. You are not just delivering content, you are guiding attention step by step. Anchoring is a specific form of framing where the first piece of information sets a reference point for everything that follows. Once an anchor is established, people tend to evaluate new information relative to that anchor. For example, if you introduce a high standard first, any reasonable option afterward feels more acceptable. If you introduce a low standard first, the same option may feel excessive. This principle is widely used in negotiation, pricing, and decision-making, but it applies to everyday communication as well. The first impression you create often becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. Perception is also heavily influenced by identity. People do not simply evaluate ideas objectively. They evaluate whether those ideas align with who they believe they are. If a message threatens their identity, it triggers resistance. If it supports their identity, it invites agreement. This is why direct contradiction often fails. When you tell someone they are wrong in a way that challenges their self-image, they defend themselves, even if your argument is correct. A more effective approach is to align your message with a version of their identity that allows change without loss of dignity. For instance, instead of saying, "you are mistaken," a more strategic approach might be, "you clearly care about getting this right, and there's another angle that might strengthen your position." This reframing does not attack identity, it supports it. It allows the person to adjust their thinking without feeling diminished. Influence often depends on preserving the other person's sense of self while guiding them toward a different conclusion. Emotional state plays a crucial role in perception. A person who is calm processes information differently than a person who is stressed, angry, or anxious. When emotions are elevated, logic becomes secondary. This means that in high-tension situations, trying to win with pure reasoning is ineffective. The first task is to stabilize the emotional environment. This can be done through tone, pacing, acknowledgement, and presence. Once the emotional intensity decreases, the mind becomes more receptive to structured thinking. Language itself carries weight beyond its literal meaning. Certain words trigger stronger reactions than others. Words associated with control, obligation, or criticism can create resistance, while words associated with choice, collaboration, and respect can create openness. For example, saying, "you need to do this," often creates tension, while "it might help if we approach it this way" invites cooperation. The difference is subtle, but its effect is significant. Influence is often decided by these small linguistic choices. Clarity is another essential factor. When a message is vague, people fill in the gaps with their own assumptions, and those assumptions are often negative or cautious. Clear communication reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty increases comfort. When people understand exactly what is being proposed, why it matters, and what the expected outcome is, they are more likely to engage. Ambiguity, on the other hand, creates hesitation. The more precise your message, the easier it becomes for others to evaluate and accept it. Repetition also shapes perception. Ideas that are repeated consistently become more familiar, and familiarity creates a sense of truth. This does not mean repetition guarantees accuracy, but it does influence acceptance. When people hear the same idea multiple times in slightly different ways, it begins to feel more credible. This is why influential communicators reinforce their core message consistently rather than constantly changing direction. Consistency builds recognition, and recognition builds trust. Social influence cannot be ignored. People are highly responsive to what others believe, especially those they respect or identify with. When an idea is presented as widely accepted or supported by credible individuals, it gains strength. This is not merely about popularity, it is about perceived validation. If others have already accepted something, it reduces the perceived risk of accepting it yourself. This is why testimonials, endorsements, and group behavior have such a strong effect on decision-making. However, perception can also be distorted. Biases, assumptions, and past experiences can lead people to misinterpret even clear communication. A person who has had negative experiences in the past may interpret neutral statements as threats. A person with strong pre-existing beliefs may filter new information to confirm what they already think. This is why influence requires patience. You are not always dealing with a neutral mind. You are often working through layers of prior conditioning. To manage this, it is important to acknowledge perspectives before attempting to change them. When people feel that their viewpoint has been recognized, they become less defensive. This does not mean agreeing with everything they say. It means demonstrating that you understand how they arrived at their position. That understanding creates a bridge. Without it, your message feels disconnected. With it, your message feels relevant. Another powerful concept in perception is contrast. People evaluate things not in absolute terms, but in comparison. Something feels large or small, expensive or cheap, difficult or easy, depending on what it is compared to. By carefully choosing comparisons, you can shape how your message is received. If you want something to feel accessible, compare it to something more difficult. If you want something to feel valuable, compare it to something less effective. Contrast provides perspective, and perspective influences judgment. Silence is also a tool of influence. Many people underestimate its power because they feel the need to fill every gap in conversation. However, silence creates space for thought. It allows the other person to process, reflect, and sometimes reveal more than they intended. It also signals confidence. A person who is comfortable with silence appears more composed and in control. In negotiation and persuasion, silence can shift pressure onto the other person, encouraging them to respond or reconsider. The way you handle disagreement is another critical factor. If you respond to disagreement with aggression or defensiveness, you reinforce opposition. If you respond with curiosity and control, you maintain influence. Disagreement does not have to be a conflict. It can be an opportunity to refine understanding. When you treat it that way, the conversation remains productive rather than adversarial. Finally, perception is influenced by outcome expectation. People are more likely to engage with something if they believe it will lead to a positive result. This belief does not have to be certain, but it must be plausible. Your role as an influencer is to make that positive outcome visible and believable. When people can clearly see how a decision benefits them or aligns with their goals, their willingness to act increases. Many people assume communication is simply the act of speaking clearly, but at a higher level, communication is the art of controlling attention. If you cannot hold attention, you cannot influence. If you cannot guide attention, your ideas remain scattered in the listener's mind. The difference between average communicators and highly influential ones is not just what they say, but how they structure the delivery so that it becomes easy to follow, easy to remember, and difficult to ignore. The first rule of effective communication is simplicity. Complexity may impress, but simplicity persuades. When ideas are complicated, people become mentally fatigued, and fatigue reduces engagement. A tired mind defaults to resistance or avoidance. This is why influential communicators strip their ideas down to the essential core. They remove unnecessary details, jargon, and distractions. This does not mean they oversimplify important concepts to the point of distortion. It means they present ideas in a way that is accessible without being shallow. The goal is clarity, not oversimplification. Clarity begins with structure. A message without structure feels chaotic, and chaos weakens influence. When people cannot see the direction of your thinking, they struggle to follow it. A strong communicator organizes ideas in a logical flow, first establishing context, then presenting the main idea, then supporting it with reasoning or examples, and finally reinforcing the conclusion. This flow creates a mental pathway for the listener. Instead of forcing them to assemble the message themselves, you guide them step by step. This reduces cognitive load and increases acceptance. Another essential element is pacing. Many people speak either too quickly or too slowly, and both extremes reduce effectiveness. Speaking too quickly overwhelms the listener, making it difficult for them to process information. Speaking too slowly risks losing attention. Effective pacing adapts to the complexity of the message. Important points are delivered with slightly more space, allowing them to register. Less critical information moves more quickly. This variation keeps the listener engaged and ensures that key ideas are not missed. Tone carries more influence than most people realize. The same sentence can produce completely different reactions depending on how it is delivered. A calm, controlled tone signals confidence and stability. An aggressive tone signals pressure and can trigger resistance. A hesitant tone signals uncertainty and may reduce credibility. Influential communicators develop control over their tone so that it supports their message rather than undermines it. They do not rely on volume or intensity to persuade. They rely on steadiness. Word choice also plays a crucial role. Certain words carry emotional weight, and that weight can either support or damage your influence. Words that imply judgment, blame, or control often create friction. Words that imply collaboration, possibility, and respect tend to create openness. For example, replacing "you are wrong" with "there might be another way to look at this" changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. The message remains corrective, but the delivery becomes acceptable. This is not about being overly soft. It is about being strategically precise. Repetition is another tool that strengthens communication. A single exposure to an idea is rarely enough to create lasting impact. Influential communicators repeat their key points in different ways throughout the conversation. This repetition reinforces memory and increases familiarity. However, repetition must be subtle. Simply repeating the same sentence verbatim can feel mechanical. Instead, the idea should be rephrased, supported with examples, or revisited from a different angle. This keeps the message fresh while maintaining consistency. One of the most overlooked aspects of communication is listening. Many people think influence comes from speaking well, but in reality, it often comes from listening better than others. Listening provides information. It reveals what the other person values, fears, and expects. Without this information, your communication becomes guesswork. With it, your communication becomes targeted. When you listen carefully, you can respond directly to what matters most to the other person, which significantly increases your effectiveness. Listening also builds trust. When people feel heard, they become more open. They lower their defenses and engage more fully. This creates an environment where influence can occur naturally. In contrast, when people feel ignored or interrupted, they become resistant. Even if your message is strong, it will struggle to penetrate that resistance. Listening is not passive. It is an active process that requires attention, patience, and discipline. Non-verbal communication is equally important. Body language, eye contact, facial expressions, and posture all contribute to how your message is received. If your words say one thing, but your body signals something else, people will trust the nonverbal cues more. For example, if you claim confidence but avoid eye contact and fidget, your message loses credibility. Alignment between verbal and nonverbal communication creates consistency, and consistency builds trust. Silence is a powerful component of communication. Many people feel uncomfortable with silence and try to fill it immediately. However, silence can be used strategically. It gives the listener time to process information, and it can also create emphasis. A pause before or after an important point makes it stand out. Silence can also encourage the other person to speak, revealing more information that you can use to guide the conversation. Mastering silence is a sign of control. Storytelling enhances communication by making ideas more engaging and memorable. A well-told story captures attention and creates emotional connection. It allows the listener to visualize the situation and relate to it. This makes the message more impactful. However, stories must be relevant and purposeful. Random or overly long stories can distract from the main point. The best stories are concise and directly connected to the message you want to deliver. Confidence is another critical factor. Confidence does not mean arrogance or dominance. It means clarity and certainty in your delivery. When you speak with confidence, people are more likely to take your message seriously. This confidence comes from preparation, understanding, and self-control. It is not about pretending to be certain when you are not. It is about communicating what you know with clarity and acknowledging what you do not know without hesitation. Adaptability is what separates good communicators from great ones. Every audience is different. What works in one situation may not work in another. Influential communicators adjust their style based on the context and the people involved. They can be direct when needed and more exploratory when appropriate. They can simplify complex ideas for beginners and add depth for more experienced listeners. This flexibility allows them to remain effective across a wide range of situations. Another important principle is focus. Many people dilute their message by trying to include too many ideas at once. This reduces clarity and impact. Influential communicators focus on one core message at a time. They build around that message and ensure that everything they say supports it. This creates a strong, coherent impression rather than a scattered one. A focused message is easier to understand, to remember, and act upon. Feedback is also essential. Communication is not complete until you know how your message was received. This requires paying attention to responses, both verbal and nonverbal. If the listener seems confused, disengaged, or resistant, adjustments are needed. Influential communicators do not continue blindly. They adapt in real time based on feedback. This makes their communication dynamic rather than rigid. Finally, communication must lead to action. Influence is not just about being understood, it is about creating movement. This means your message should clearly indicate what the next step is. If people understand your idea but do not know what to do with it, the influence is incomplete. A clear call to action, even if subtle, helps translate understanding into behavior. In summary, communication is the mechanism through which influence is delivered. It transforms internal understanding into external impact. By mastering simplicity, structure, pacing, tone, listening, nonverbal cues, and adaptability, you gain control over how your message is received. This control does not come from force. It comes from precision. When your communication becomes precise, your influence becomes consistent. And when it becomes consistent, it becomes powerful. Chapter 4. If communication is the vehicle of influence, then trust is the fuel that allows it to move forward without resistance. Without trust, even the most polished message collapses under suspicion. With trust, even an imperfect message can succeed. This is why trust is not just an ethical advantage, it is a strategic necessity. People do not follow ideas alone. They follow people they believe in. Understanding how trust is built, maintained, and repaired is central to influencing anyone in a meaningful and lasting way. Trust is often misunderstood as something that takes a long time to build. While deep trust does require time, initial trust can form quickly based on signals. These signals include consistency, honesty, emotional control, and alignment between words and actions. People are constantly scanning for these indicators, often without realizing it. When they detect inconsistency, exaggeration, or hidden intent, trust decreases. When they detect clarity, calmness, and congruence, trust increases. This process happens rapidly and continuously. One of the strongest foundations of trust is consistency. When your behavior remains stable across different situations, people begin to predict how you will act. Predictability creates a sense of safety. It reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty lowers resistance. If someone knows that you are fair, measured, and reliable, they are more likely to consider your perspective seriously. In contrast, if your behavior changes depending on convenience or pressure, people become cautious. They may listen, but they will not fully engage. Honesty is another critical component, but it must be understood correctly. Honesty does not mean saying everything without filter. It means representing reality accurately and avoiding deception. It also means acknowledging limits. When you do not know something, admitting it often strengthens your credibility rather than weakening it. People are used to exaggerated confidence. When they encounter measured honesty, it stands out. It signals that your goal is clarity rather than control. This distinction matters more than most realize. Emotional control plays a significant role in trust. When you remain composed under pressure, people perceive you as stable. Stability suggests reliability. On the other hand, if you react impulsively, become defensive, or lose control in challenging situations, your influence weakens. This is because people begin to associate you with unpredictability. They may hesitate to rely on your judgment. Emotional control does not mean suppressing all feelings. It means managing expression so that your reactions do not undermine your message. Another important aspect of trust is intent. People are highly sensitive to whether you seem to be acting in their interest, your own interest, or a combination of both. If your communication appears purely self-serving, resistance increases. If it appears balanced or mutually beneficial, openness increases. This is why framing matters again. When you demonstrate that your proposal considers the other person's needs, not just your own, trust grows. This does not require sacrificing your goals. It requires integrating them with the goals of others. Reliability strengthens trust over time. When you follow through on commitments, even small ones, you create a pattern. That pattern becomes your reputation. Reputation is essentially accumulated trust. Once established, it amplifies your influence. People are more willing to accept your ideas because past experience suggests that you are dependable. This is why consistency in action is more important than occasional impressive performance. Influence is built on repetition, not isolated moments. Transparency can also enhance trust when used appropriately. When people understand your reasoning, they feel more comfortable with your conclusions. Explaining not just what you think, but why you think it, invites others into your thought process. This reduces suspicion and increases engagement. However, transparency must be balanced. Overloading someone with unnecessary details can create confusion. The goal is to provide enough insight to build understanding without overwhelming the listener. Respect is a fundamental element that supports trust. People are more receptive to those who treat them with dignity, even in disagreement. Disrespect, whether subtle or obvious, damages influence immediately. This includes dismissive language, interruptions, or ignoring someone's perspective. Respect does not require agreement. It requires acknowledgement. When people feel respected, they are more willing to reconsider their position. When they feel disrespected, they become defensive and closed. Vulnerability, when used carefully, can strengthen trust. Sharing appropriate personal experiences or admitting challenges can make you more relatable. It signals authenticity. However, vulnerability must be controlled. Excessive or misplaced disclosure can reduce credibility. The key is balance. Strategic vulnerability humanizes you without undermining your authority. It shows that you are real, not just performing a role. Another factor that influences trust is alignment. If your interests consistently conflict with those of others, trust becomes difficult to maintain. If there is visible alignment, trust becomes easier. This does not mean interests must be identical, but they should not be consistently opposed. When people believe that your success is connected to their success, they are more likely to support you. This alignment creates a cooperative dynamic rather than a competitive one. Trust is fragile. It can take time to build, but can be damaged quickly. A single act of dishonesty, inconsistency, or disrespect can undermine a long period of credibility. This is why maintaining trust requires continuous attention. It is not something you achieve once and then ignore. Every interaction either reinforces or weakens it. Influential individuals are aware of this and act accordingly. Repairing trust is possible, but it requires effort. The first step is acknowledgement. Ignoring a breach of trust or minimizing it often makes the situation worse. Clear acknowledgement shows accountability. The second step is explanation, not as an excuse, but as context. People want to understand what happened. The third step is corrective action. Without visible change, words alone are insufficient. Over time, consistent behavior can rebuild trust, but it requires patience. Authority can support trust, but it cannot replace it. Position, title, or expertise may give you initial credibility, but if your behavior does not support that credibility, it fades. Conversely, even without formal authority, a person with strong character and consistent behavior can become highly influential. This is why influence is not limited to leadership roles. It is accessible to anyone who understands and applies these principles. Another dimension of trust is social validation. When others trust you, new individuals are more likely to trust you as well. This creates a compounding effect. Testimonials, endorsements, and positive reputation signals accelerate trust building. However, these signals must be genuine. Artificial or exaggerated validation can backfire if discovered. Authenticity remains the core requirement. Trust also interacts with time. The longer someone observes consistent positive behavior, the stronger their trust becomes. This is why patience is important. Attempting to rush trust often leads to shortcuts that damage it. Sustainable influence requires a long-term perspective. It values steady growth over immediate gain. In high-stakes situations, trust becomes even more critical. When decisions involve risk, uncertainty, or significant consequences, people rely heavily on who they trust. In such moments, your past behavior matters more than your current argument. If you have established trust, your influence increases dramatically. If you have not, even strong logic may fail. It is also important to recognize that trust is not uniform. A person may trust you in one area, but not in another. For example, someone may trust your technical expertise, but not your judgment in personal matters. Understanding these distinctions allows you to operate more effectively. You can build trust in specific domains, rather than assuming it applies universally. Ultimately, trust is the stabilizing force of influence. It reduces friction, increases openness, and allows ideas to move more freely. Without it, communication becomes a struggle. With it, communication becomes a pathway. Building trust requires consistency, honesty, emotional control, respect, and alignment. Maintaining it requires ongoing attention. Repairing it requires accountability and action. If you master trust, your influence becomes sustainable. It is no longer dependent on momentary persuasion techniques. It becomes part of your presence. People begin to listen not just because of what you say, but because of who you are. That is the level where influence becomes enduring, reliable, and deeply effective. Chapter 5. If trust is the foundation and communication is the delivery system, then emotion is the force that actually drives decisions. Most people like to believe that decisions are made logically, but in practice, emotion acts as the primary filter through which logic is accepted or rejected. People rarely act unless they feel something strong enough to move them. Understanding how emotion operates and how to engage it without manipulation is essential if you want to influence anyone effectively. At a basic level, emotion answers a simple question: why should I care? Without a compelling answer to that question, even the most well-structured argument will fail to produce action. This is why purely rational communication often feels incomplete. It informs, but it does not move. Emotion provides urgency, relevance, and energy. It transforms passive understanding into active engagement. There are a few dominant emotional drivers that consistently influence human behavior: fear, desire, pride, belonging, curiosity, and relief. Each of these can shape decisions in different ways. Fear pushes people away from perceived danger. Desire pulls them toward perceived benefit. Pride reinforces identity and self-image. Belonging connects decisions to social acceptance. Curiosity opens the door to exploration. Relief offers an escape from tension or uncertainty. The skilled communicator does not rely on one emotion alone, but understands when and how to engage each appropriately. Fear is one of the strongest motivators, but it must be handled carefully. When used excessively or irresponsibly, it creates resistance, anxiety, or avoidance. People may shut down rather than act. However, when presented in a balanced way, acknowledging risk while also offering a clear path forward, fear can be constructive. It highlights consequences and creates urgency. The key is not to trap people in fear, but to guide them through it toward a solution. Desire works differently. It is forward-looking and opportunity-driven. When people see a clear benefit that aligns with their goals, they become more open and motivated. Desire is often more sustainable than fear because it creates positive momentum. Instead of acting to avoid loss, people act to gain something meaningful. Effective influence often combines both, acknowledging what could go wrong while clearly showing what could go right. Pride is closely tied to identity. People want to feel competent, respected, and aligned with their self-image. If your message supports their sense of pride, they are more likely to accept it. If it threatens their pride, they are more likely to reject it. This is why direct criticism often fails. It challenges identity and triggers defensiveness. A more effective approach is to align your message with their desire to be capable and respected. This allows them to adjust without feeling diminished. Belonging is another powerful force. Humans are social by nature, and they often look to others to determine what is acceptable or desirable. When a message is connected to a group identity or shared norm, it becomes more persuasive. People are more likely to adopt behaviors that align with those around them, especially if those people are respected or similar to them. This is why communities, networks, and social proof play such a strong role in influence. Curiosity is a subtler but highly effective emotional driver. When you create a gap between what someone knows and what they want to know, you generate interest. This is often called an information gap. People feel a natural pull to close that gap. This is why questions, partial information, and open loops are so effective in capturing attention. Instead of giving everything at once, you guide the listener through a process of discovery. This keeps them engaged and invested. Relief is often overlooked, but it is extremely powerful. Many people operate under some form of tension, uncertainty, confusion, pressure, or doubt. When your message offers a clear resolution to that tension, it creates immediate value. Relief reduces stress and increases trust. It signals that you are not adding complexity, but removing it. This makes people more receptive to your influence. Emotional intelligence is what allows you to apply these drivers effectively. It involves recognizing not only your own emotions, but also the emotions of others. This recognition allows you to adjust your communication in real time. If someone appears anxious, a calm and reassuring approach is more effective. If someone appears disengaged, a more energetic and engaging approach may be needed. Emotional intelligence turns influence from a fixed strategy into a dynamic process. Timing is critical when dealing with emotion. Attempting to introduce logic when someone is emotionally overwhelmed is rarely effective. In such moments, the priority is to stabilize the emotional state. This can be done through acknowledgement, tone, and pacing. Once the emotional intensity decreases, the mind becomes more receptive to structured reasoning. Skipping this step often leads to frustration because the message, no matter how logical, fails to connect. Authenticity is essential in emotional influence. People are highly sensitive to insincerity. If they sense that emotion is being artificially manufactured or exaggerated, trust decreases. This is why emotional expression must be genuine. You do not need to display extreme emotion to be effective. Controlled, authentic expression is often more persuasive than dramatic displays. It signals stability and sincerity. Another important concept is emotional contrast. Just as contrast shapes perception, it also shapes feeling. Moving from tension to relief, from uncertainty to clarity, or from doubt to confidence creates a stronger impact than remaining in a single emotional state. This transition makes the message more memorable and more compelling. It gives the listener a sense of progression rather than stagnation. Language plays a significant role in shaping emotion. Certain words evoke stronger reactions than others. Descriptive language can make ideas more vivid and engaging. However, it must be used with precision. Overly dramatic language can reduce credibility, while overly neutral language can reduce impact. The goal is to strike a balance where the message is both engaging and believable. Storytelling is particularly effective for emotional engagement. A well-constructed story allows the listener to experience emotions indirectly. They can see the situation, feel the tension, and understand the outcome. This creates a deeper connection than abstract explanation. However, the story must be relevant and purposeful. It should reinforce the message, not distract from it. Emotional consistency also matters. If your emotional tone shifts unpredictably, it can create confusion. Consistency helps people understand what to expect and how to interpret your message. This does not mean being monotonous. It means ensuring that your emotional expression aligns with the message and remains coherent throughout the interaction. Another factor is emotional resilience. Not every attempt at influence will succeed immediately. People may resist, disagree, or delay. Maintaining composure in these situations is critical. If you react negatively, you weaken your position. If you remain calm and adaptive, you maintain influence. Resilience allows you to continue guiding the conversation even when challenges arise. Ethics play an important role in emotional influence. It is possible to exploit emotions for short-term gain, but this often leads to long-term damage. Fear can be exaggerated, desire can be manipulated, and belonging can be misused. While these tactics may produce immediate results, they undermine trust and credibility. Sustainable influence respects the emotional well-being of others. It seeks to inform and guide, not to exploit. Ultimately, emotion is the energy behind influence. It determines whether a message is ignored, considered, or acted upon. By understanding emotional drivers, applying them with precision, and maintaining authenticity, you can significantly increase your ability to influence others. Emotion does not replace logic, it activates it. When both are aligned, influence becomes far more effective. At this level, influence is no longer about simply presenting ideas. It is about creating an experience where the listener feels understood, engaged, and motivated to act. When you achieve that, your communication moves beyond information and becomes transformation. That is the point where influence becomes not only powerful, but lasting. Chapter 6. If emotion provides the energy behind influence, then identity determines its direction. People do not make decisions randomly. They make decisions that are consistent with how they see themselves or how they want to be seen. This is one of the most powerful, yet often overlooked principles of influence. When your message aligns with a person's identity, resistance decreases. When it conflicts with that identity, resistance increases, even if your message is logical and beneficial. Identity operates at multiple levels. There is personal identity, which includes beliefs about one's intelligence, values, habits, and capabilities. There is social identity, which relates to group membership, family, profession, culture, or community. There is also aspirational identity, which reflects who a person wants to become. Each of these layers influences decision-making. Effective influence recognizes which layer is most relevant in a given situation and communicates accordingly. When you ask someone to take an action, you are not just asking for behavior. You are implicitly asking them to confirm or adjust their identity. For example, if someone sees themselves as careful and risk-aware, they will resist actions framed as impulsive or uncertain. However, if the same action is framed as strategic and well-considered, it becomes compatible with their identity. The action has not changed, but the interpretation has. This is why framing through identity is so effective. People are strongly motivated to maintain internal consistency. If they believe they are disciplined, they will act in ways that reinforce that belief. If they believe they are independent, they will resist anything that feels controlling. This consistency creates predictability in behavior. Once you understand how someone defines themselves, you can anticipate how they are likely to respond. More importantly, you can shape your message to align with that definition. One of the most effective techniques in identity-based influence is affirmation before direction. When you acknowledge a positive aspect of someone's identity, you create openness. For example, saying, "You're someone who values accuracy," or "You clearly take responsibility seriously," reinforces their self-image. Once that image is activated, they are more likely to accept suggestions that align with it. The key is that the affirmation must be genuine. False or exaggerated praise reduces credibility and weakens influence. Aspirational identity is particularly powerful because it focuses on growth rather than preservation. People are often willing to change if the change moves them closer to who they want to become. This is why influence is more effective when it connects to future identity rather than only current behavior. Instead of saying, "You should do this," a more effective approach might be, "This is the kind of decision someone in your position would make if they want to reach the next level." This shifts the conversation from obligation to progression. Social identity adds another dimension. People are influenced by the norms of the groups they belong to or respect. If a behavior is seen as normal within a valued group, it becomes easier to adopt. If it is seen as outside the group norm, resistance increases. This is why referencing group behavior can be effective. However, it must be done carefully. The group should be relevant and credible to the listener. Otherwise, the reference loses impact. Another important concept is identity protection. When people feel that their identity is being challenged or threatened, they become defensive. This defense can take many forms, including denial, argument, or withdrawal. Direct confrontation often intensifies this reaction. A more effective approach is to create a path where change does not require loss of identity. This can be done by reframing the situation in a way that preserves dignity. For example, instead of saying, "You were wrong," you might say, "Given the information at the time, that approach made sense, but now we have additional data that suggests a better option." This allows the person to update their position without feeling that their identity has been damaged. The goal is not to avoid truth, but to present it in a way that maintains psychological safety. Identity is also shaped by language. The words people use to describe themselves influence their behavior. When someone says, "I am not good at this," they create a fixed identity that limits action. When they say, "I am learning this," they create a flexible identity that supports growth. As an influencer, you can guide this language subtly. Encouraging more constructive self-descriptions can open the door to new behaviors. Repetition strengthens identity. The more often a person acts in a certain way, the more that behavior becomes part of their self-concept. This is why small, consistent actions are important. If you can guide someone to take a small step that aligns with a desired identity, it becomes easier for them to take larger steps later. Each action reinforces the identity, and the identity reinforces future actions. This creates a cycle of consistency. Public commitment is another factor that strengthens identity. When people express a belief or intention publicly, they are more likely to follow through. This is because their identity becomes tied to that statement. They want to appear consistent, both to themselves and to others. Encouraging small, voluntary commitments can therefore increase the likelihood of action. However, these commitments must be genuine. Forced or pressured commitments often lead to resistance or reversal. Identity can also be influenced through environment. The people someone interacts with, the content they consume, and the situations they experience all contribute to how they see themselves. While you may not control all these factors, you can influence some of them. By shaping the context in which decisions are made, you indirectly shape identity. For example, placing someone in a group where a certain behavior is normal increases the likelihood that they will adopt that behavior. Another important aspect is identity conflict. Sometimes people hold multiple identities that are not fully aligned. For example, someone may see themselves as both ambitious and risk-averse. In such cases, decisions become more complex. Influence in these situations involves resolving or prioritizing identities. By emphasizing one identity over another, you can guide the decision-making process. This requires careful observation and understanding of what matters most to the individual. Authenticity is critical in identity-based influence. If your message appears to artificially manipulate identity, it can backfire. People may feel that you are trying to control how they see themselves. This creates resistance. The goal is not to impose an identity, but to highlight and support aspects that already exist or are genuinely desired. Influence works best when it feels like alignment rather than imposition. Another factor is long-term consistency. Identity is not changed in a single interaction. It evolves over time through repeated experiences and reinforcement. This means influence at the identity level requires patience. You may not see immediate results, but consistent alignment of message and behavior can gradually shift how someone sees themselves. This is one of the most durable forms of influence because it affects not just individual decisions, but the framework through which decisions are made. It is also important to recognize that your own identity affects your influence. How you see yourself shapes how you communicate. If you see yourself as uncertain or ineffective, that will be reflected in your behavior. If you see yourself as thoughtful, reliable, and capable, that will also be reflected. Self-perception influences external perception. This means that developing a strong internal identity is part of becoming influential. Ethics remain essential at this level. Identity is deeply personal, and influencing it carries responsibility. The goal should be to support growth, clarity, and constructive behavior, not to manipulate or control. When influence respects identity, it builds trust. When it exploits identity, it damages it. The difference may not be immediately visible, but it becomes clear over time. Ultimately, identity is the framework through which all influence operates. It determines what feels right, what feels wrong, and what feels possible. By aligning your message with identity, you reduce resistance and increase acceptance. This alignment does not require deception. It requires understanding. When you understand how people see themselves and who they want to become, you gain the ability to guide decisions at a deeper level. At this stage, influence moves beyond surface communication. It becomes a process of alignment between message, emotion, and identity. When these elements work together, influence becomes natural rather than forced. People do not feel persuaded, they feel understood. And when people feel understood, they are far more willing to move in the direction you suggest. Chapter 7. If identity shapes the direction of influence, then behavior determines whether influence translates into real-world results. Many people can create agreement in conversation, but far fewer can convert that agreement into consistent action. This gap between intention and behavior is where most influence fails. Understanding how to guide behavior ethically and effectively is essential if you want your influence to produce outcomes rather than just temporary alignment. At the core of behavior is simplicity. The more complex an action appears, the less likely it is to be executed. Even when people agree with an idea, they may not act on it if the path forward is unclear or demanding. This is why one of the most powerful ways to influence behavior is to reduce friction. Friction includes anything that makes action feel difficult, Too many steps, unclear instructions, uncertainty about outcomes, or lack of immediate reward. When you remove friction, you increase the probability of action. Clarity is the first step in reducing friction. People need to know exactly what is expected of them. Vague suggestions such as, "You should improve this," rarely lead to action because they do not define a clear starting point. In contrast, a specific instruction such as, "Begin by reviewing this one section and making these 3 adjustments," provides a concrete entry point. Once the first step is clear, the barrier to action decreases significantly. Influence becomes practical rather than theoretical. Another important principle is momentum. Large actions are often resisted because they feel overwhelming. Small actions, however, feel manageable. When someone takes a small step, it creates a sense of progress. That progress builds confidence and reduces hesitation about future steps. This is why breaking actions into smaller components is so effective. Each completed step reinforces the behavior and makes the next step easier. Over time, these small actions accumulate into significant change. Consistency plays a major role in behavior. Once people begin acting in a certain way, they tend to continue, especially if the behavior aligns with their identity. This creates a feedback loop. Action reinforces identity, and identity reinforces action. As an influencer, your role is to initiate this loop. Encourage initial actions that are easy to adopt and aligned with the person's self-concept. Once the loop is established, behavior becomes more self-sustaining. Incentives also influence behavior, but they must be understood carefully. External rewards such as recognition, financial gain, or approval can motivate action, but they are not always sufficient for long-term consistency. Internal incentives such as personal satisfaction, alignment with values, or a sense of achievement are often more durable. Effective influence combines both. It acknowledges external benefits while also connecting the action to internal motivation. This creates a stronger and more stable drive. Another critical factor is environment. Behavior does not occur in isolation. It is shaped by surroundings, context, and available options. If the environment supports the desired behavior, action becomes easier. If it opposes the behavior, action becomes more difficult. For example, if you want someone to adopt a new habit, placing them in an environment where that habit is normal increases the likelihood of success. Influence, therefore, extends beyond communication into the design of context. Timing again plays a significant role. Even if a person agrees with an idea, they may not act if the timing is not appropriate. Factors such as workload, emotional state, and external pressures affect readiness. Influential individuals recognize this and choose moments where action is more feasible. They do not push for immediate compliance in every situation. Instead, they align their requests with moments of opportunity. Another important concept is commitment. When people make a commitment, especially voluntarily, they are more likely to follow through. This is because commitment creates a psychological obligation to remain consistent. Encouraging small, low-pressure commitments can therefore be highly effective. For example, asking someone if they are willing to try something for a short period is often more successful than asking for a long-term change immediately. Once they begin, continuation becomes easier. Accountability strengthens behavior further. When actions are visible or tracked, people are more likely to complete them. This does not require strict control. Even simple forms of accountability, such as follow-up conversations or progress checks, can increase consistency. The key is to create a sense that the action matters and that it will be revisited. This reinforces importance without creating excessive pressure. Feedback is essential for sustaining behavior. When people receive clear feedback on their actions, they can adjust and improve. Without feedback, they may become uncertain or disengaged. Feedback should be specific and constructive. It should highlight what is working and what can be improved. This helps maintain momentum and prevents stagnation. Positive feedback reinforces behavior, while corrective feedback refines it. Another factor is emotional reward. Behavior is more likely to continue if it is associated with a positive emotional experience. This does not mean every action must be enjoyable, but there should be some form of satisfaction, progress, or recognition. When people feel that their effort leads to a meaningful outcome, they are more likely to continue. Influence, therefore, involves not only guiding action, but also ensuring that the experience of action is rewarding. Barriers must also be addressed. Even motivated individuals encounter obstacles. These can be practical, such as lack of resources, or psychological, such as fear of failure. Identifying and reducing these barriers increases the likelihood of success. This requires observation and communication. Ask what might prevent action and address those concerns directly. When obstacles are acknowledged and managed, resistance decreases. Habits are the long-term expression of behavior. When an action becomes habitual, it requires less conscious effort. This is the ultimate goal of behavioral influence. Instead of requiring constant motivation, the behavior becomes automatic. Habits are formed through repetition in consistent contexts. By guiding repeated action in a stable environment, you help transform intentional behavior into habitual behavior. Another important aspect is adaptability. Not every approach will work for every person. If a strategy fails, it should be adjusted rather than abandoned. Influential individuals remain flexible. They observe results, identify what is not working, and modify their approach. This adaptability ensures that influence remains effective across different situations and individuals. Resistance to behavior change is natural. People are often attached to their current habits and routines. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty creates hesitation. Addressing this resistance requires patience and understanding. Instead of forcing change, guide it gradually. Provide support, clarity, and reassurance. Over time, resistance decreases as familiarity increases. Ethics remains central in behavioral influence. It is possible to push people into actions that benefit you but harm them. While this may produce short-term results, it damages trust and long-term influence. Sustainable influence ensures that the actions you encourage are beneficial, or at least not harmful, to those involved. This creates alignment rather than exploitation. Another key point is follow-through. Influence does not end when someone agrees or begins to act. It continues through the process of execution. Supporting individuals as they implement actions strengthens your influence and increases the likelihood of success. This support can take many forms, including guidance, feedback, and encouragement. Ultimately, behavior is where influence becomes visible. It is the point where ideas translate into reality. By focusing on clarity, simplicity, momentum, environment, and consistency, you can guide behavior effectively. This requires more than persuasion. It requires structure and support. At this level, influence is not just about changing minds. It is about changing actions in a way that is sustainable and aligned with both logic and identity. When you can consistently guide behavior, your influence becomes tangible. It moves beyond conversation and becomes impact. That is where influence achieves its full potential, not in what people say they will do, but in what they actually do over time. Chapter 8. If behavior converts influence into action, then social dynamics determine how far that action spreads. No individual operates in isolation. Every decision, belief, and behavior exists within a network of relationships, expectations, and observations. This means influence is rarely contained to a single interaction. It travels through groups, reputations, and shared environments. Understanding how influence expands across social systems allows you to move from isolated persuasion to scalable impact. Human beings are highly responsive to what others around them think and do. This tendency is not a weakness, it is an adaptive mechanism. In uncertain situations, people look to others for cues on how to behave. This is known as social proof. When individuals see that others, especially those they respect or identify with, have accepted an idea or taken a certain action, they become more likely to do the same. The perceived risk decreases because the behavior appears validated. However, social proof is not uniform. The effectiveness of social influence depends on relevance. People are more influenced by those who are similar to them or who occupy a position they aspire to. A message endorsed by a distant or unrelated group carries less weight than one supported by a familiar or respected group. This is why understanding the social context of your audience is critical. Influence increases when the reference group feels meaningful to the individual. Reputation plays a central role in social influence. Reputation is essentially how others describe you when you are not present. It is built over time through consistent behavior, communication, and results. A strong reputation amplifies your influence because it precedes you. People are more receptive to your ideas when they already associate you with credibility, reliability, or expertise. Conversely, a weak or negative reputation creates resistance before you even begin to communicate. Networks are the channels through which influence travels. Some individuals occupy central positions within these networks. They are well connected, respected, and often observed by others. Influencing such individuals can have a multiplier effect because their actions and opinions are more visible. This does not mean you should ignore others. It means recognizing that influence can be strategically directed to maximize reach. Understanding network structure allows you to apply effort more effectively. Another important factor is group norms. Every group has implicit rules about what is acceptable, expected, or valued. These norms shape behavior often more strongly than explicit instructions. When a behavior aligns with group norms, it is reinforced. When it conflicts, it is resisted. To influence effectively within a group, you must understand these norms. This requires observation and sensitivity. Attempting to impose an idea that directly contradicts established norms without preparation often leads to rejection. One way to introduce change within a group is gradual alignment. Instead of presenting a completely new idea, connect it to existing norms. Show how it extends or improves what the group already values. This reduces resistance because the change feels like evolution rather than disruption. Over time, as the new behavior becomes more common, it can shift the norm itself. Influence at the group level is often incremental rather than immediate. Leadership, formal or informal, plays a significant role in shaping social dynamics. Leaders act as reference points for behavior. Their actions signal what is acceptable and what is not. However, leadership is not limited to titles. Individuals who consistently demonstrate competence, reliability, and confidence often become informal leaders. Their influence emerges from behavior rather than position. Recognizing and engaging with both formal and informal leaders is important when attempting to influence a group. Visibility also affects influence. Behaviors that are visible are more likely to be adopted because they can be observed and imitated. Invisible behaviors, even if effective, do not spread easily. This is why making positive actions visible can accelerate influence. When people see others engaging in a behavior and receiving positive outcomes, they are more likely to replicate it. Visibility turns individual action into social evidence. Another key concept is momentum within groups. When a behavior begins to gain traction, it can reach a tipping point where adoption accelerates. Before this point, influence may feel slow and effortful. After it, the same behavior can spread rapidly with less effort. Recognizing when momentum is building allows you to reinforce it. This might involve highlighting early adopters, sharing results, or increasing visibility. Once momentum is established, resistance tends to decrease. Resistance within groups often takes a social form. Individuals may hesitate to adopt a behavior not because they disagree with it, but because they fear standing out or being judged. This is especially true in environments where conformity is valued. Addressing this type of resistance requires creating a sense of safety. When people feel that adopting a new behavior will not isolate them, they become more willing to act. This can be achieved by normalizing the behavior and showing that others are already engaging in it. Communication within groups differs from one-on-one interaction. Messages must be clear, consistent, and adaptable to multiple perspectives. Ambiguity can lead to misinterpretation, which spreads quickly in group settings. Consistency ensures that the message remains stable as it moves through the network. Adaptability allows it to resonate with different individuals within the group. Balancing these elements is essential for effective group influence. Conflict is another aspect of social dynamics. Differences in opinion are inevitable in any group. How these conflicts are managed affects influence. Aggressive or dismissive approaches often escalate tension and reduce openness. Constructive approaches, which focus on understanding and resolution, maintain influence even in disagreement. The goal is not to eliminate conflict, but to handle it in a way that preserves relationships and trust. Another factor is shared identity. Groups often form around a common purpose, value, or experience. This shared identity creates cohesion and influences behavior. When your message aligns with this identity, it gains strength. When it conflicts, it faces resistance. Understanding what binds a group together allows you to position your message in a way that feels relevant and supportive rather than disruptive. Incentives within groups also matter. These can be formal, such as rewards or recognition, or informal, such as approval and status. People are influenced by how their actions will be perceived within the group. Aligning desired behaviors with positive incentives increases adoption. This does not require manipulation. It requires awareness of what the group values and how behavior is evaluated. Trust at the group level is built through consistent experience. If a group repeatedly sees positive outcomes from certain actions or messages, trust increases. If outcomes are inconsistent or negative, trust decreases. This collective trust influences how new ideas are received. A group with high trust is more open to change. A group with low trust is more resistant. Another important aspect is communication flow. In some groups, information moves quickly and openly. In others, it is restricted or filtered. Understanding how information flows helps you determine how to introduce and reinforce your message. In open systems, visibility and repetition are key. In closed systems, targeted communication and relationship building may be more effective. Influence within social systems is not about controlling everyone. It is about understanding how individuals interact and how behavior spreads. By aligning with group norms, leveraging social proof, engaging key individuals, and maintaining consistency, you can extend your influence beyond individual interactions. At this level, influence becomes scalable. It moves from one person to many, from isolated decisions to shared behavior. This does not happen by chance. It happens through deliberate understanding of social dynamics and careful application of influence principles. Ultimately, social influence is about creating alignment within a network. When individuals see that a behavior or idea is accepted, beneficial, and consistent with group values, they are more likely to adopt it. When enough individuals adopt it, it becomes the new norm. That is the point where influence becomes embedded in the system rather than dependent on constant effort.